George Gantz of spiralinquiry.com, and this is episode number 2. So, George, we made it through episode 1.
Absolutely. Daniel, it was great fun. Let's have another one.
Right. So, okay, there's a couple things on the top of my mind, and I think we should just delve right into it. So, both of you and I agreed that we should spend some time on the dog metaphor, analogy, illusion. All those are applicable. And then, but before we jump into that, the viewer should know that it was George's birthday yesterday. And George, what was the magic number?
70. Number 70. Rounding the corner.
That's the corner, is it? Okay, all right. What is on the other side there after that 90 degree?
It feels exactly the same as it did the day before. There's no difference. It just, the way we view it. It is. It was actually satisfying to have some connection with all of the kids and daughters-in-law, son-in-law, grandkids. I think there's a total of 18 now in that group. So it was a good day. Very good day. But it does bring to mind the things. It's a different way of looking at things when you realize there's a host of individuals out there, kids and grandkids, and they will reach into the future well past the end of my life, and yet I have a commitment to that period of time after I'm gone. So it creates a feeling of obligation for the future in a way that we sometimes don't think about. We're just sort of in our day-to-day and what's in it for us, what's going on for us, and yet this provides a perspective on the continuity, the great chain of existence that continues, that was before, that came to us, that gave us this, and now off into the future with those that will follow. So it's an interesting way of thinking about things.
You're such an interesting person to speak with, because you've just laid down 4 or 5 tantalizing vectors of thought that we can go down. And I want to start with the more challenging one that may be abrasive, but and it's not necessarily tied to age, right? But there's something that's perplexed me about religion and about the need for. There's a narrative that says that the need for religion has to do with our ability to face the fear of death and dying, right? Does that ring true with you at all?
There's a motivation there, I guess, to find answers to things that we don't know and don't understand. And obviously the things that extend beyond our birth and beyond our death are things that we don't understand. Humans are storytellers, so we like to have a narrative that explains things, even the things that we don't understand. So I think there's a motivation to have a grand explanation. But I think there are also experiences that we have in this life that give us a feeling that that there is something beyond. And as I said, having kids and grandkids is one of those tangible pieces of information about there is something beyond beyond the end of my life. And the other thing so religion can and probably arose as a way of creating a grand narrative that helped draw people together with a similar belief structure and a similar way of looking at things. And then through ritual and bonding practices, that becomes embedded, and in time it becomes entrenched, and things can happen that aren't necessarily part of the original purpose. And I think in some way we all need some kind of a narrative like that, some kind of explanation that will fill our desire to feel like we're part of some very significant eternal process that's underway, whether it's whether it's a process that you might want to describe in scientific terms, or whether you want to get more mystical about it. I think we all have a need for some of that.
Well, and the revisionary nature of science, I mean, there's definitely a tradition, but in terms of the longevity of the scientific method and the tradition of science, it is changing. And by definition, this is what makes science so powerful, that it's so revisionary. Possibly what is so powerful about narratives and religion is that it is a little bit, it's more, and I'll stay away from dogmatic. I mean, if we can slice off the problematic pieces of the dogma and say that there's this cultural narrative that spans generations, going back to probably the feeling that you had about that transmission to future generations, even in your own clan, right? This is something that I think is, cuts right to the point of what that is for, or how we have used that transmission, to pass on the information, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's very complex too. I mean, there are dogmas in science, so that's just one observation, that the humans have this capacity to hold on to things long past their useful life, you might say, and religion also has an evolutionary capacity to it, and like any other human endeavor, it can become entrenched and dogmatic and rigid. But I think one of the things that the great religious traditions offer is if you bring an open mind to them and you try to get from them, glean from them the things that are really important, there's a universality to it. It's not necessarily just a set of stories that are kind of rigid and codified, and then you hang on to those and it becomes dogma. I think there's a different way of approaching religion. I like to think about the fact that there's great wisdom built into all of the religious traditions, and being able to understand what that wisdom is, and be able to kind of sort through the things that have become ritualized or dogmatic and taught over generations, but really see the inner truth that is part of that religious tradition is something that then can be embraced and can enliven one's own perspective and one's own life. So my view may be a little bit different than somebody that is, kind of within the box. But I think it's important to recognize the value that can bring to human lives, and maybe give us a little bit of humility about, being too judgmental about what beliefs other people are holding on to.
Yeah, one thing that I've come to know about you, George, and as our friendship builds over time, I could summarize your perspective as being a universal one and progressive. So I think that's you're nodding your head. So I think it's probably a fair assessment, right?
Yeah, and I think those are important messages of the great religions. Progressive, the greater good, the positive aspects of life and love, and the things that people bring to life. So that's a message of religion. I also think it's a message of evolutionary science, and this might be a little bit radical in some areas, but I think the message of evolution, the evolution of galaxies, the evolution of complexity, the evolution of life, the evolution of humans, I think the message is that, yeah, this is also the same kind of message coming from science as we see from religion. The importance of relationships and interconnectedness and reciprocity and collaboration and cooperation, and ultimately in the human capacities for love and collaboration. So
yeah, I was thinking I was spending a little bit of time on a famous continental philosopher by the name of Martin Heidegger. So you would know who that is, and he has this concept of presenting like into the present, and in somewhat of an improvement, a version 2.0 on Hegel, where he's so much about history. There's span of cognition that moves into that receives from the future, but's informed from the past. Kind of. That's a very simplistic way of deconstructing that. But the heuristic that I was using, and I was just meditating on it as I was, oddly enough, running around doing some yard work yesterday, is that you can frame that in an individual way, and then you can frame it in a relational way with other people. And as soon as you frame it with other people, it takes on a subtle difference and nuance, which I think can be informing, right? So I would refer to it somewhat like a pluralistic imagining, right? So you can imagine, you can kind of reconcile in your own thought to say, I could see how that makes sense, the way we project into the future and it's informed by the past. Even back to Aristotle, it's something like a combination of inductive reasoning and virtue ethics and these types of things, right? But I guess my point was that when you start to look at different perspectives to inform a single perspective, it's very illuminating, right? It kind of takes you outside of the seed of your own thought and gives you an objective framework to look back at yourself, either through the lens of a group or through the lens of projecting further or looking to something more immediate. Does this make sense?
Yeah, and that's what a cultural narrative is. It's a consensus around a set of imaginings that connect the past and the future. So your culture will create a narrative, and if it's a good narrative and if it's got evolutionary benefit, it will last and it will continue because it's providing, say it's a tribal narrative about, the dangers of, the big bad creatures out there. Well, that narrative might have some educational value for that culture and therefore be transmitted and passed on into future generations. In some of those future generations, it may no longer be useful, but that takes time for that cultural narrative to evolve in response to the changing circumstances. So that collective narrative or that collective view of things could be viewed as cultural, and it is ultimately the many individuals contributing to it and building the narrative and building the belief structure that goes into it. So it's a creation of a set of individuals. And one of the things that I sometimes think about, I realize that in the Western philosophical tradition, we have this concept of reason, and we have this concept of individual reasoning and individual cognition and individual existence. The Cartesian dualism comes out of I think, therefore I am. So it's a very based on the individual's own perspective and own mind and own identity. And yet it's all based on a life that comes from a past that's been given to you by your ancestors, created the conditions by which your life and your body is existent. And then you have language, you have mathematics, you have stories, you have connections, and without that, those connections through language and storytelling and the love of your parents and neighbors and all that, without that, you wouldn't have a functioning self or functioning cognition or functioning language. You had to have none of it. So you are fundamentally, even your ability to do this philosophical reasoning is fundamentally interconnected with all that came before and gave you the language and gave you the capacity to think in these ways. So there's a sense in which we can never escape the community and the culture which has created what we are and the way we think. So, it's one thing to think about the past and the future as an individual processes it, but then to realize that that's embedded in this fully interconnected culture of language and history with everybody else essentially with everybody else on the planet. So
Yeah. Well, this brings me into, a few points to kind of to slow down and pause and just get the nuance of what I'm about to say. This is the gift of the presenting, right? And the double meaning there. But back to Heidegger, it's that we're thrown into this consciousness. We're thrown into it, and it is reflective in beyond just the single person, right? It's this, and then it's a movement towards, if we stay with Heidegger. But yeah, that's fascinating, and I think that it's inescapable. I want to bring you an example of something that's biologically relevant. So I was adopted. I was put up for adoption when I was born, right? And so I never actually I never met my birth mother until I was 22. And in cognitive science and they in social science, they look at populations and do brain studies, especially on populations of twins. I think you're aware of this, right? And twins, better yet, that were separated at birth and put up for adoption in different homes in dramatically different cultures are, like when that email comes across the scientist's desk, it's like, okay, I'm on a plane, I'm going to go and interview these people, because it's the basis of a that anomaly within our population is just so telling in terms of what we can extrapolate in terms of knowledge, right? So, and I know firsthand that when I met my biological mother, imagine like nuances and behaviors and and mannerisms exactly the same. I've never met her at all, right? And so I'm kind of adding to reaffirming your claim here that there is so much that we uh, maybe erroneously or falsely consider to be individual, right? And yet this is punctuated in our current state of being, right? It's like, I'm here because of that complete phylogenetic chain that has manifest into what we refer to as Daniel and what friends and family refer to as George. It's just fascinating.
that's a great way of drawing out that idea that we are interconnected. We're individuals. This is, again, one of these paradoxes. We are individuals. We experience life as an individual, but we're fundamentally connected across multiple dimensions. And there's the genetic dimension, the chromosomes that that were put into the the egg that then divided up, and then there's the epigenetic process of actually how that unfolds and what environmental triggers are going on and what's happening when. Again, an amazing display of the process of life at work and its amazing complexity, yielding an individual who is then drawing inputs from even before birth, drawing inputs from the environment around and processing that, and then the interactions with parents, the interactions with culture and society, reading languages, which then gives you insights or input from cultures, thousands of years in the past and around the globe, all of which builds to create this unit of individualism, which is Daniel or George, and different from any other unit of individual, including those who have identical twins, quite different individuals. There's the debate about cloning of, if you take a human mind and you clone it into a computer, so it's a perfect replica, and then are you going to have just one individual in two places, or what? Well, as soon as you've created that separation between the clone and the original individual, there are two individuals, because that clone is not going to have the same experience from that point on as the individual did. So that raises questions of personal identity. It's just a fascinating kind of kind of set of things to talk about.
Without the phylogenetic chain, and this is one of the things that I'm working on my novel called Will Freeman, and it has to do with creating artificial intelligence from a biological substrate. So this is an improvement upon the current narrative of artificial intelligence being, transistors and wires and circuits and all this kind of thing, right? So it's the basis of the story is that this entity of her name is Sophia for obvious reasons, is that she's she gains the entire knowledge of humanity, right? And like if we as individuals have a limited memory back, well, we can just our lifetime, and then it's codified in stories and in literature and this type of thing. The idea about this Ubermensch like creation is that she has all of human history and prehistory at her I wouldn't say fingertips, but at the tip of her biological neural net, right? And so she has this. I mean, could you imagine that you could, just think back to a memory of your childhood that's as vivid today as it was then, but do that same type of imagining all the way back to the prehistory of the Lascaux caves? That's kind of the idea, that she becomes this embodiment figure of humanity. And the point of the book is that humanity is actually headed to a collapse, which, considering our environmental narrative, it's even realistic.
That's a
By
very
the way,
cheery thought, Daniel. I really think that's so cheery to think about. But I do have a question, and that is, how does Sophia get access to the past?
Yeah, that's a really good. I had to in the development of this, I wanted to keep it away from time travel and all these types of things. So it actually comes in the forms of dreams. And so this nicely and poetically can be woven into the character development as she moves through time and space. She's in the present, but a lot of what happens in the past, you could be, maybe significant historical events like the crossing of the Rubicon, the death of Socrates, all these types of things animate her character and inform her, and they come through the dreams and the imagination of basically her programming. There's an assumption here, though, that it's not a programming like we would conceive of programming, because there's a real disconnect with how we frame ontological frameworks in computer science versus imagining something that was biology centric, right? And because it's a story, I'm not really facing the truth telling aspect of. I'm not confronting whether this is actually viable, right? There could be, even for myself, a reader, well, I guess that would be a reader or myself saying that this is just not possible, right? We can't truly impregnate experiences into somebody, into a body. You just can't download that, right? That could be just the way it is.
Yeah, that's one of the questions. The one I was driving at is that once the past has gone by, what remains of the past to be looked at from now and in the future is whatever record has been established of the past. There's a geological record, there's an anthropological record, there's an oral narrative record that's passed down, and then there's a written record that's passed down. So if you have a super intelligence that you're trying to give a picture or glimpse of the human past, you're limited in terms of what you can provide. Or maybe you're speculating about a sort of a pan consciousness, where some people think about the fact that every quantum event that's ever happened, everything that's ever happened, has an imprint in the universe, somewhere in the expanding universe. And so this creates the concept of a pan consciousness. It's aware of everything of all times. And if your creation could tap into that pan consciousness and have direct access, then in some sense, to the actual events of the past, you know.
No, I'll say right away it's not, because I'll tell you what. Sophia, in terms of wisdom, wisdom is something that, if we talk about the intellectual giants of our past, right? We did like Chartres and that tradition of Newtonian giants, the standing on the shoulder of giants. It's become a bit of a cliche, but very much how I approach things at the publishing company and the media outlet, at planksip. So what I'm saying is that if she's the summation of what we know to be good, then I'm happy with that, right? I don't need to infer to the the lost works that we didn't have, right? I mean, like if we look at the Attic Tragedians, or we look at some of the plays, we know of a lot of lost works in terms of literature that we just can't tap into. Sometimes we can extrapolate based off of what other works say about them, but these are full end stops into our knowledge, right? They're limitations, and what I'm trying to give her is that embodiment, and it's a bit of a call of action towards people who want to immerse themselves in the classics, right? Because I'm a big fan of that. I would rather see uh, a truth functioning journalistic approach in society towards classical literature, as opposed to the obfuscation of current events. And so I see that we have this opportunity to return to the classics, return to the wisdom, return to the way things were in the past, as guiding principles into the future, right? And we face such uncertainty as we're moving into things like climate change, which are really paramount in my what I talk about. And I guess there's a missing point in this book as well, is that imagine a group of the most intelligent uh, scientists, philosophical leaders in our society, and we're saying, what do we put in this biological entity? So we can only put into the biological entity what we're aware of, right? So it would be everything from our universities, everything from our, I'm not too much leaning on the religious side of things, but it's still a part of the story. So it is important, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100% about the importance of classics. And I think one of the, I forget who it was who said, if you don't pay attention to history, you're going to repeat it, something like that. That's and the classics, and even the classical studies of religion, contain so much wisdom. And if we don't pay attention to it, if we lose that connection with that, with those wisdom traditions, then we're making it up as we go, and that's not going to be a particularly useful way to approach things. So I agree with you wholeheartedly.
It's not based on any cultural history, and that feels very dangerous. It feels To me, it feels like Rousseau comes to mind. However intoxicating that language can be, of revolution, tear down, start over kind of thing. It's so abrasive that it scares me, right?
Yeah.
It really scares me. Whereas there's been generation upon generation upon generation that have extrapolated wisdom in different social contexts. And if we limit our perceived wisdom based off of the social context and the milieu that we swim, it's just not. It just doesn't seem to be an accurate way to predict
Right. And I think there's a
value.
message there's a message about, again, the connection between this thread of thought and evolutionary, the evolutionary dynamic in biological systems, because the value of a healthy ecology comes from diversity, and the value of a healthy wisdom tradition comes from diversity. You know, not becoming stuck, but having newness and vitality and diversity and growth and adding to and moving forward. That's where humanity can benefit most from the ideas, not just picking one set of ideas and going ahead. And I think we live in a culture where that's sort of the tendency to ignore the past and, you know, and figure that, you know, well, with these new technologies, we don't really have to worry about the past. But that's a myopic view that runs significant risks, as human history has taught us over the past millennium. So I'm on board. I'm with you.
Okay, so I want you we're gonna talk about dogs here in a minute, because we had such an enjoyable thing, and I think we can kind of change up the tone. But first, I want you to tell me about, you know, what kind of projects you're working on right now. I think it's called Long Now Boston, or there's some really interesting events that you're involved with in groups. I'd love to hear it, and I'm just going to grab my coffee here.
Okay. So yeah, I've become active. Joined the Long Now Foundation a number of years ago. They're headquartered in San Francisco, founded by Stuart Brand, who has you know, tried to, in the past with the Whole Earth Catalog and some of his later things, tried to increase the expansion of the way we think about things. And the Long Now Foundation is kind of looking at the future of humanity and planting the idea out there that we really need to be conscious of long-term trajectories, both the deep past and the long-term future. So they've kind of set a marker of thinking about things in a 10,000 year time frame. So that's kind of the way they structure things. Oh, and in terms of Sophia, what you were talking about before, one of the Long Now Foundation projects is compiling a library of civilization. What works and books should be collected in this library? You know, if we go through some circumstance that flattens civilization and we have to start over again, what would be some of the most useful books to have for that revival of civilization? So that's one of the interesting projects that ties in. So we have a local group in Boston, Long Now Boston, that puts on events and, you know, and in a local scale, and again tries to encourage long-term thinking. And we actually have an event coming up. We have an event coming up tonight about communicating with yourself in the future around the issues of climate change. It's called Dear Tomorrow. The idea is you write a letter to the future about what you'd like to see and how that might change your behavior. So I think that's interesting. But the one we have in May is going to be on Sunday, May 2nd, and it's with these guys. I don't know if you can see that. Let me bring it down a little bit. So this was everything's backwards, so I have to GIF it. This is actually a poster inviting the recipient to the greatest party of all times in 2269.
Yeah.
So it's a couple of guys, Mike and Peter in London, created 2269.co. And the theory is they're going to start planning for the greatest party of all times in 250 years. So I've got my invitation to the party. I don't expect I'm ever going to make it, but you know, one of my kids will take it and then maybe pass that on. And there's a little thing in the back that says who owned it. And the idea is, let's think about the future as a positive opportunity. You know, what could we imagine would be a way of celebrating 250 years in the future? And what kinds of technology, what kinds of philosophy, what kinds of drink will will we be able to enjoy in the future? So that's that's kind of an interesting way of making our relationship with the future tangible, and I think that's a way of leading us to think differently about the future and maybe behave differently in the present, because we know there's a future out there to think about. So that's a little bit about.
That's brilliant. I just love that. That's really great.
So May 2nd, longnowboston.org. People can look it up, or they can look on Spiral Inquiry. I have a link to it as well. Should be fun.
Great. Dogs, shall we
talk about dogs now?
Now we get to now the episode begins, right? Now we get to talk about.
Yeah. Well,
this is my dog hypothesis, or God hypothesis, whichever way you want to do it, right? And we were joking about that. We reverse it. We go, maybe we just have it backwards, because these animals seem to have it all kind of figured out. I mean,
well, they're very genuine. They're very empathic. They're very loving. They can also be territorial. They can also be kind of individualistic, and they really don't worry about much beyond the immediate now. And so there's some benefit to that. But anyway, you were talking about the way they get on a trail, right? They get their noses are so powerful, so amazing. They I'm sure have a cognitive map of the world that's based upon smell, not on sight. Humans tend to rely on sight. But you were talking about that pattern that they, when they're on a trail, they get off the trail, the pattern that they use to kind of get back on the trail and find it. And that kind of pattern is very common in nature.
Yeah.
So, for example, foraging ants, they tend to follow two types of patterns. One is a pattern where they've been given some information from one of their co-ants about where there's food, and so there's sort of this straight line pattern based upon the messaging. But then if they're just new territory, they're foraging, they'll kind of wander around. And there's also scientific studies that indicate that biochemicals, at the deep level of cellular behaviors, or Brownian motion and moleculars and gas molecules, will exhibit a similar pattern, and it's called the random walk.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Pattern. So here's an example of this ubiquitous form of randomness in nature, in the world, all around us, this randomness. But it's a randomness that is mathematically the most efficient way of doing a search in an environment with with possibilities that you just simply don't know what the pattern is. So the random search, or the random walk, is the most efficient way to process the unknown environment and explore the unknown environment. So it's interesting that it's random, and yet all of these examples are examples of purposeful behavior. So this is one of the paradoxes that I see in the way we talk about evolution, nature, physical world. We see patterns that are random, and that leads some people to make the conclusion that, that existence is random. Everything is random. It's all based on this randomness. And yet you can also see within those examples of randomness the purpose that is being satisfied by using that random procedure. So I think this is one of those interesting connections between one way of looking at the world as random and one way of looking at the world as purposeful. And there we go. I haven't read the book, but I've read some of Leonard Mlodinow's stuff. And I remember recently hearing an interview where he was talking just enthusiastically about the complexities of the world and how amazing it is and how wonderful it is. And then he said he still fundamentally believes at his core that if we knew all of the initial conditions of every subatomic particle, we could know every aspect of the future. So
Wow.
kind of a strict determinism in spite of his, you know, in spite of his enthusiasm for complexity and uncertainty and the laws of physics. I mean, he's a great physicist, no doubt. And he co-authored, I believe it was, the article with Stephen Hawking that concluded that I think it's characterized as saying there is no theory independent reality to be accessed, that our only way of accessing reality is with theory. We have to have theory that carries us into that exploration, which sounds a little bit mystical to me. And so anyway, tell me about the Drunkard's Walk, which you know more about than I do.
Well, first of all, I got to give a plug for Leonard Mlodinow. He's a really good writer, and for anybody that's in the scientific world, it may seem like an oversimplification, but he's really speaking to that broader audience, the layman audience, and actually referring to an audience as layman is somewhat of a pejorative to laymen's everywhere, because I think that, I mean, you could be an academic in a field like mathematics, for example. That's where your pedigree is, right? And you want to get into now you have all the skills to jump into another like a cross or interdisciplinary type of thing. And the further you go away from your foundational training, the more difficult it can be, right? We've got a series coming up with Jacob Bronowski, and I'm hosting it with a co-host by the name of Scott and Dan's High Ontology, and we're doing a 13-part series on Bronowski's The Ascent of Man. And he was a mathematician before delving into anything historical, cultural, anything of the sorts. So this is really interesting, and Scott brought it to my attention as one of the most important pieces of a modern or contemporary culture there is, and what a gem being produced back in the 70s. So anyways, back to Mr. Mlodinow. You have people like Bronowski, you have people like Carl Sagan, the disciples that somewhat follow in the scientific and academic communities that are disseminating this information in ways that are digestible, for a broader audience. But to me, that's only part of the equation. There's fundamentally a disconnect in a function of what we do with this information, right? So if you're an author like Leonard Mlodinow, you make the books, you go out and then people buy and consume your books. And it's a very much a one-way kind of approach, right? And what I would really like to see in terms of active participation, active engagement, is maybe somewhat similar to what the strategy was to write this letter to yourself into the future about the way you would like to see, the environment, or this type of thing, right? It's that active engagement of doing something, even if it's in the written, creative type of form, right? This is what's going to codify this into culture, right? And I know this is one of the fundamental founding core principles of what I'm trying to work on with planksip, is that it's not just about a top-down approach. It's about creating a two-way opportunity for the academics and the thought leaders to disseminate downwards, and then for the plurality of sorts to then disseminate upwards. and even the up and down is not really, but I think you get the point.
Yeah, the idea is, in a sense, sometimes we have these experience of these great scientists who will then create a work for the public, the broader public, but it's not necessarily an opportunity for engagement. It's just them casting their wisdom down for for the lesser mortals that don't have necessarily access to that. And that's that is one of the problems of the academia concept in general. It can become isolated in an ivory tower, and sometimes jargon comes into play that makes it very difficult for people that aren't part of the jargon to really follow. I do think most of the scientific literature for public audiences is pretty good, and I think most of those people are committed to trying to do the best they can to make the material accessible. So Leonard Mlodinow is one of those greats in physics that do work pretty hard. E.O. Wilson was another one that comes to mind. So yeah, that's valuable to do, but it's not quite the same thing as engaging in a conversation where all of us need to have an opportunity to engage with the thoughts and the ideas that are shaping our time and our world. And that concept of randomness is one of them.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
shapes the way you think about it. And I think the random side of that has been in the ascendant for quite some time. Last half of the 20th century, I think that concept of randomness has taken hold of the cognitive frame that we use to think about ontology being the way things are. And I think this purposeful side of it has sometimes been missing from the conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so do you notice how I kind of skirted the subject because you said, what did you think about this book on randomness, right? I mean, I didn't answer a direct question. I just went into more of a I cast a wider net to say, about like mainstream scientific writing in general. I wanted to ask you, and it's something that we could work on together in this series. I think I'm extrapolating into the future, and I'm thinking that pretty quickly, I would say maybe 4 or 5 episodes down the road, we're going to really understand and be in sync with each other's thoughts, which we are, I think, already to a great degree. But once we've done a surface kind of overview of our main talking points, we're, I want to keep it fresh. And so here's what I would propose. We do an alternating focus on a book, a title, movie, something like that, right? So if we wanted to take something like Leonard Mlodinow's book, and we wanted to spend some time on it, maybe break it down into 4 or 5 episodes, what we could do is spend one episode doing the show or doing the book, kind of going through it. The next episode more about talking about what we discovered, where those implications go, and then returning back to a focus on a piece of literature. I wanted to know what your thoughts would be on something like that.
I think that's great, and that's the process I think that has been most valuable for me to gain from the materials that I read. You read something, you try to internalize it, you have some kind of a conversation with someone else or with it, and you learn through that process of dialogue and chewing on something, if you want to call it that. Rumination, I guess, is the word that's sometimes used for that. And I think that's a valuable way to gain understanding, because a lot of times we will all tend to read something from the perspective that we're in. And so we'll see what we want to see or what we're comfortable seeing. We won't necessarily see the complexities and the nuances and the other parts of it that we don't have the familiarity with. So I think that's a great way attack a work.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
You're up for it.
Another
Okay.
one.
That's the thing about George. He's usually up for almost anything, right? I mean, I haven't thrown anything at
Can't
you.
forget this one.
Yeah,
You
we
can't
were going to
forget
do
this
that
one.
one too. Yeah. So in a spirit of a friendship here, here's how what I would propose the ground rules. It's all we need in terms of rules, but it's more of a tradition. Okay, so I had a friend that's passed away. He was a friend of the family, and he was definitely my elder when I was a little disturber as a youth. He was, the one that was part of the family that would say, he'd shake his head and say, "What were you thinking?" What kind of thing. But what we did together is we would exchange book titles, right? So he would say to me, "Why don't you read this book?" And I would go away and I'd read it, and then he would then it was my turn to suggest a book for him, right? So that's what I'm kind of proposing is that we but we do it, we do it together. And so if you're suggesting something for me, we'll start to go through it, and my discovery process will actually happen, on a week to week basis. Do you see what I mean? And what I'm going to suggest for you isn't just what I want to see. I'm trying to think, what do I want George to read? Like,
Mhm.
considering our relationship, our friendship, I'm thinking, what could I give George to read that I think would be great for George, right? And then the same thing on the other side.
That's a deal. Sounds good.
Okay. Do you know that this guy, we called him Big Dan, right? And this fellow, he gave me Plato's Apology. This is where I read it for the first time. And I think back to how ignorant, or I guess, because after I read it, I read the book, and I kind of went through it, skimmed through it, I suppose, kind of didn't understand all of the references or the characters, or I didn't really take the time to think about it. And then, I met him at a family dinner, and I said, "Yeah, I read it. It's pretty good." What? Right? Like, that's it? Did you really read it? Kind of thing. Because afterwards, it's like, if your knowledge grows, it's like, people are spending enormous amounts of time on this book, right?
Yep. And it shows that that's another one of those ways in which things are ultimately interconnected with almost everything else, because Plato, taken as simply a simple book, not very long, not a lot of words, skim through it. Yeah, it's a good book. But then realizing that it has threads that go into every aspect of philosophy over the past 2,000 years.
Yeah.
There's Plato threads everywhere. And if you start to understand some of those connections, the amount of knowledge that you have to build to get a full appreciation of what Plato was talking about is really, it's a lifetime of scholarship to be able to really appreciate that. So that's a good example of how even ideas are fundamentally connected to each other and happen in a context. And you can't just read something and think you understand it, because it's got a connection and context that's very, very deep and very broad, and
Yeah.
sometimes wrong.
And sometimes wrong and misleading, and can point you down garden paths, or blind alleys, these types of things. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that journey. We're kind of approaching the hour mark here, and I thought, you know what, can we bring it back to that truth functioning aspect, that scent that the dog follows? Do you think we can do that and talk about our best friend brethren? I mean, I'll preface it this way, and I'll just throw out this concept, as Cicero pointed out, that friendship was the highest of virtues. It's a little different than goodness in terms of the goodness in itself and Plato and all this type of thing, but I think what's happening here is that he's if you focus on a friendship, it's actually it's like you and I hold a friendship, right? And so for all the philosophical means of a friendship, what how can we embody that, right? And so there's something rich there, and um, what the dog and the canine species actually does is, despite the perverse nature of how we have bred these dogs and the dog species, the canine species, into such a I guess, like, I mean, we make them to fit in our pockets. We have them so that they have breathing problems and skin problems and all sorts of horrific things, possibly for vanity sources. And yet they're a species that is just born as a friend to humanity, right? They're just domesticated and such close proximity in the spirit of a friendship that we could, possibly imagine. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
Well, that's one example. Is I like Michael Pollan has written some interesting things. I don't think he wrote this about dogs, but from a biological evolutionary standpoint, the most successful species is humans. The second most successful species is dogs,
huh.
because they befriended humans. So you look at the population of dogs in the world compared to the population of any species of wild animal. Dogs have been very, very successful from an evolutionary standpoint because they have that friendship capacity.
Right. Now, I'm going to disagree with you here. And I had this thought the other day, and I thought, could the point be made that humanity is the most successful species? I mean, I get that point. However, this is something that I was informed by the writings of E.O. Wilson. Okay, and in terms of biomass, the ants contain an equal biomass to humans on the planet. With what we're doing to the environment, okay, there is a real threat that the biodiversity that sustains our existence as one species, okay, could be threatened. I mean, I don't know how to put an actual number or predictive number on that, but we're looking and trying to extrapolate 250 years into the future, 500 years into the future, 5,000 years into the future, and there's nothing saying that humanity will actually be here. Okay,
Mhm.
now I don't completely advocate towards that, but it's something that is a possibility that we're not here. And I've done it. I've thought about it in comparison to a species like the ant species, multiple. And I look at that and I think to myself, we're one species. They are, I don't know how many species of ants there are, right? But in terms of just survival with rapid environmental condition changes, I think, we're not, we occupy this Goldilocks zone of survival based on an environment that is increasingly being forced out of equilibrium. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And I agree with you 100%. And thank you for taking me to task for using a word in a very casual, light way that had a lot of import. And that was the word success. So, in a number of different dimensions that you might want to measure, you could say that humans are the most successful species. And one of those measures is how much they've subjugated every other species. So that's not necessarily an ethically proper way of evaluating success. And one of the features of what our species has been able to do is, first of all, eliminate all other potential competitors among the Homo, you know, family. All the rest of the lines of the human tree have been eliminated by Homo sapiens sapiens. So that's.
But wait a
And
minute, you wouldn't say that Homo sapiens were responsible for intentionally eliminating. I mean, I think there's a natural sort of selective pressure that did that. I mean, if I'm imagining uh, the Neanderthals, which actually have evidence of a mixture, and then there was and I don't know what the name is, but the dwarfish version.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they just fizzled out. I don't know if that was really, something like the conquests of the human history, where we're attacking and tribal and we're eliminating them from that sort of. We did that to our own species, interspecies kind of thing.
Right, which is a good point of a good evidentiary suggestion that we probably did this with those other species too.
Huh.
That's ultimately why they didn't survive.
Oh, interesting.
Because the competition among the human tribal branches was such that only one made it. Anyway, that's kind of a sidebar to the issue of success. And we are the one species that is capable of terraforming and misterraforming planet Earth in ways that are highly destructive. And so we better do a better job at foresight, wisdom, thinking ahead, understanding the ramifications of the consequences of our actions today. So we better get smart pretty quick, right?
Yeah. One of the really key points of the Bronowski thing on the ascent of man is he verbalizes it as the difference, the uniqueness of humanity is the fact that we can change our environment, and we can do that with our intellect, with that expansion of the prefrontal cortex. The brain went. We're basically at just under 3 pounds. But I think we went from just under a pound to just under 3, sort of thing, over rapid development. So that imagination, that ability to abstract, coupled with the ability to move and articulate things with these hands, was really what drove things in our favor, right? And to be able to then manipulate the environment is great, but we've come to this crossroads, this Rubicon, where I feel that if we're moving forward, we really need to move forward in a way that we're making the environment sustainable. That's such an overused word, but we're part of a biodiversity. We're part of a complexity. And so if we're going to continue doing things intentional, if we are going to embody anything that is supposed to represent the ideal human, the ideal man, in a Christian tradition, it was, I walk daily with Jesus at my side because he's the embodiment of human. Well, I say we should change the word of Jesus to steward. I'm being kind of funny here, but
Steward or Stewart Brand? Are you talking Steward with a D or Stewart with a D?
Yeah, we call
it. Yeah. Well, there's a whole argument about the meaning of the word as translated in King James and in the Genesis of dominion, because the original Hebrew word, as I understand it, was the word radah. And the cultural meaning of the word radah was much more of a stewardship model, the responsibility of the shepherd for his flock, not dominion in the way it was translated. So that may have been a mistranslation, that was done early in the Latinization and then the English, the turning the Christian church into an English speaking church. It may be a mistranslation that's really mess things up pretty badly. The word
Yeah.
dominion. Anyway, I think we have the responsibility, both ethically as well as biologically, to fix the messes that we're creating and to create an ecology. It will be a post Anthropocene ecology, but it's got to be one that makes room for humans to survive and thrive and love each other and be positive. And also it's got to find room for the rest of the biological profundity of life on Earth to be able to sustain itself in a vibrant, ecologically healthy way. So I agree with you on that.
So what we'll do, I think we can, unless there's anything else you want to do to wrap up, I think I wanted to summarize and say, let's make our first book Consilience. It's not a pick on my side or your side. I don't think, because it's kind of like the name of our show. But we can have some fun, and no end time date on having to blast through it. I think we can just rotate one book day, one conversation day, right? We're going weekly. So next week, why don't we rip into chapter 1 of Consilience, and we'll put it into the show notes, and bring a little bit of value to week 3, and just continue down that vein of literary pastiche and exploration and education.
Sounds good, Daniel. Sounds good.
Awesome. Okay. All right, George. That's it for this episode, and thanks a lot for joining us, and we welcome everybody to next week as well.
All right. Thank you.